Quick question. When you hear about coffees from Central America, what countries do you think of? How about Panama and Costa Rica? Anyway, thanks for coming back to the YouTube channel, Convoy Road Coffee Roasters. I want to talk to you a little bit about Central American coffees. It actually makes sense for Costa Rica and Panama to be the first ones you think of. Costa Rica's got some fantastic coffees, always have, and they're just getting better all the time. Now, Panama, little side note there, in the late 1980s, I was stationed in Panama with the Airborne Infantry Unit down there. I was drinking Army coffee out of the mess hall. Anybody who's served in the Army can tell you that Army coffee is crap. But time out. They grow coffee in this country. I'm going to go find some. And I did. And it was Panama Baquete coffee. It blew my mind how much better it was than that crap they were serving in the mess hall. But I didn't know it at the time, but that really started me on pursuit of the perfect cup, this magnificent obsession I have with coffee. Anyway, so we know that Panama and Costa Rican coffees are fantastic. But what if I told you the other countries in Central America, except maybe Belize, and I only say that because I haven't been able to find a coffee from Belize at all, are producing some really great coffees. Let's start with Nicaragua. Coffee was first introduced to Nicaragua by Catholic missionaries in 1790, but it wasn't until 50 years later that the crop began to take off. With the growing demand for coffee across the globe, Nicaragua's coffee scene began to flourish, and by 1870, coffee was the nation's main export crop. Today, they are the 12th largest exporter of coffee in the world. The Jinotega region is where a lot of the greatest coffees are grown. We just had a Nicaragua La Bastilla Las Brisas as our February 2025 Origin of the Month, and it was fantastic. It's a coffee with bright acidity, so we had to tone it down a little bit. A lot of times people will mistake a bright acidity coffee with something that's bitter, but it's not. It's just bold. We had to tone it down a little bit. I cut it a little bit, changed the roast profile, and so we could really get those flavor notes, all of them. And the flavor notes in this one were milk chocolate, almond, clementine, dried apricot, and golden raisin. Really silky mouthfeel, refreshing finish. By the way, we still have some of this coffee. Go to our store link, and you can order it. Order Origin of the Month, and in the comments put in Nicaragua La Bastilla, and I'll make sure I get a bag of coffee to you. Let's move on to Honduras, because there's some special coffees coming out of Honduras. The history there is interesting too. The French government received coffee plants from the Dutch in 1714 and used them to create the first documented coffee plantation on the island of Martinique. The coffee beans were then transported by boat through Central America to include Honduras. Coffee became a significant crop in Honduras in the 20th century. Today, coffee is Honduras' largest export, accounting for over a third of the country's total exports. Honduras is Central America's largest producer of coffee. They have surpassed Panama. They have surpassed Costa Rica. I want to talk to you about a couple of the coffees that we've brought in from Honduras. They're just fantastic. The first one is called La Hondureña, and we sold out of it very quickly. Grown entirely by women coffee farmers. It's owned by they came from two farms. Finca Pachapa El Mason, owned by Socorro Reyes, and Finca Gab, owned by Norma Lara. Another fantastic coffee we brought in was the Honduras San Vicente El Canecho Micro Lot. And this one was really special. When we saw it, we're like, man, we got to get this coffee, because this San Vicente farm is owned by this man. His name is Nelson Bade. And the coffee farm is only 1.2 acres. So he's got about 200 trees. And it's just the man, his wife, and the 3 kids that run this coffee farm. Anyway, the coffee was fantastic. But a 1.2 acre farm in Honduras. Give you a little bit of perspective. We're in Ohio, in farm country, Ohio. We live in the country. Our property here is 3.8 acres. So this guy's farm was a third of the size of our property here alone. Plus, We live in farm country, so we're surrounded by fields that are hundreds and hundreds of acres. So to put just a 1.2 acre farm, a little tiny speck of land in Honduras owned by Nelson Bade, his wife and 3 kids, working a coffee farm. That's a fantastic backstory. To try that coffee, just let me know. You can go to our shop, our store, and the link is in the comments and the description. Order a bag of origin month. Say you want Honduras El Canecho micro lot, and I'll get a bag of that to you too. $17.50. You got to try this coffee. It's fantastic. Next is El Salvador. The history of coffee in El Salvador, pretty interesting. It was introduced to El Salvador between 1779 and 1796 with imported seeds from Guatemala by local farmers. So apparently these farmers in El Salvador decided they were going to make their way into Guatemala and get some coffee seeds. But it wasn't commercially grown until much later. Back then, coffee was not new as a beverage in the Americas, having been introduced to Jonestown, Virginia settlers as early as 1609 by Captain John Smith. After the Boston Tea Party of 1773, coffee became an extremely popular beverage. The colonies back then, I don't think we were quite free yet. And there's some interesting stories about that too, with colonial shopkeepers, how after the Tea Party, they keep track of which people bought coffee and which people bought tea. The ones who bought coffee were the rebels. The ones who bought tea were the loyalists. Anyway, that's another story. We'll go into that later. So the demand had grown so much that by 1846, the government of El Salvador passed a law giving coffee growers a 7-year tax break on coffee production and the coffee farm worker a decade of exemption from military service. In 1853, El Salvador and the United States signed their first commercial treaty, further cementing coffee as El Salvador's cash crop. By 1855, El Salvador was ruled by a man named Captain General Gerardo Barrios, considered by many to be the father of coffee production in El Salvador. He passed a series of laws in order to increase coffee production, such as giving away land to coffee farmers. By 1857, it was decided that coffee cultivation should cover as much of El Salvador as it could, and growing in the eastern regions began. El Salvadoran coffees, too. The first one I want to talk to you about is El Salvador Finca Buenos Aires Red Bourbon. It was grown on the volcano of Santa Ana in the golden belt of Salvadoran coffee farming. Most interesting was this one of the flavor notes was red apple. Very popular coffee with our customers. The second El Salvadoran coffee I want to talk about is El Salvador Santa Ana Washed HG/EP. The HG stands for high grown, which is important. And most coffees are grown at high elevations, but the higher ones, they get the HG designation. That's important because at high elevations, coffee cherries mature more slowly. So they get more time for the beans to develop, and you end up with a bean that accurately reflects the terroir of El Salvador. The EP in the name stands for European preparation. That's really no big deal, except it's a requirement for European buyers. All it means is that additional hand sorting was done. The quality of the coffee is not a reflection of the quality of the coffee at all. But it was also grown in Santa Ana. And that the rich, fertile soil, high elevation, and climate all come together to provide the high-quality specialty coffees that are coming out of El Salvador. The flavor notes on this one were cocoa powder, dried fruit, nuts, and raisins. Also want to talk to you about Guatemala. The best Guatemalan coffee we have brought in was called Guatemala Blue Ayarza. And it gets its name because it was grown by smallholder farmers near Laguna Azul, which means blue lake. This lake there's a lot of folklore, a lot of legend about this lake. Some say that this lake is so deep it's connected to the ocean. Nobody knows how deep it really is, but the locals will tell you that expeditions to try to find the bottom have all ended in tragedy. Our supplier has a processing mill about 30 minutes from the lake, and they process beans from nearly 1,000 smallholder farmers there. Some of the farmers bring all their coffee in on a big truck. Others bring it in by donkey. 1 or 2 bags on the back of a donkey to bring it to the processing mill. Anyway, Dawn and I really liked that coffee. With interesting notes, there were strawberry and blackberry. It was really good. Anyway, lastly for Central America is Mexico. And I'll be quite honest with you, before we started this coffee business 4 years ago, I didn't even know they grew coffee in Mexico. But I'm glad I found out, I'll tell you. The first one I want to talk to you about was called Mexico Chiapas Turquesa. Turquesa means turquoise in Spanish. And these beans, the raw beans, actually had a turquoise tint to them. And in the first initial phases of roasting, just as the beans started changing color, that turquoise color intensified. Really good coffee. When we first introduced that coffee, the people who bought the first bags, there's actually a couple that lives in Scott, Ohio. It's 4 or 5 miles up the road. The wife bought them. The husband actually grew up in Chiapas, Mexico, and remembers playing in the coffee farms on the coffee fields when he was a kid. So that was really cool for me. His family came into town a couple of days later, and they ended up buying 6 bags to enjoy for the family. And we got good feedback all the way around. Another one I want to talk to you about is Mexico HG Oaxaca. HG in this case, high grown, like we talked about. Now, the coffee growers in this region of Mexico, they really did something special. In the late 1980s, the Mexican government cut off funding or stopped funding Mexican farmers because it was a budget constraints, a big issue. So coffee growers in the Oaxaca region formed the Oaxacan State Coffee Producers Network. This organization provides credit and saving support for its members, promotes women's organizations, technical assistance to families, life insurance for members, and funding infrastructure improvements. That was a really good coffee too. Started with a full-bodied but tempered flavor, so it didn't overpower you. Soothing honey, caramel, cherry. Still have some of that left in our warehouse too, so let me know if you want a bag in comments. Go to our store and you can order that. Order origin of the month and just put in there HG Mexico HG Oaxaca, and I'll make sure I get it to you. So it's not just Costa Rica and Panama, but that's what most people think of. But the coffee world is vast. The coffee belt is huge. There's so many countries growing coffee, and a lot of them are countries you've probably never even heard of, but they have fantastic coffees. We made a promise to our customers that we would bring them coffees from all over the world, and that's what we're doing. So if you really like coffee and you're a little bit adventurous and want to try some that you probably hadn't had before, start following us. Subscribe to the channel. We'll put out more content. Go to our website, join our Facebook group. All these links are in the description for our channel, and we're going to take you around the world in search of great coffees. So before I leave, go ahead and hit the like button, leave us a comment, especially if you want to order some of the coffees we still have in our warehouse, and subscribe to the channel for more great coffee content. By the way, not too far from Central America, there's a little island, Jamaica. We'll talk about that in future videos. You probably heard of Jamaica Blue Mountain, one of the most expensive coffees that you can find. We'll talk about that in future videos. We talk about the Caribbean island coffees. Thanks for watching, and subscribe to the channel.